There's no reason to become alarmed, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your flight. By the way, is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Avoiding Real Estate Turbulence podcast. This is your pilot, John Lafferty, with Century 21 Town and Country.
And co-pilot, Tony Abate with Ross Mortgage, and we are your real estate pilots. Our job is to be your real estate advocate and also make sure you're educated about the buying and selling process. We'll keep you informed throughout until we get you safely closed.
In a real estate transaction, there are many reasons why you can encounter turbulence. Today, we are going to talk about flood insurance and changing weather patterns and why maybe even if your home isn't in the high-risk floodplain areas, you should give flood insurance another look.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a topic that seems to happen with folks even when it's not in an area that's expected. So we all kind of think about flood insurance when we're thinking lakefront properties or properties that are adjacent to rivers. But as you know, John, it's more than that. It can be just topographical differences. I mean, locally here, there's a chunk of the city of Troy that requires flood insurance. There's no all sports lakes in Troy, but it has to do with the topography of surrounding areas. And so flood insurance, it's not just what we always think it is.
Yeah. And things are changing, right? Mm-hmm. Weather patterns are changing. Rivers are flooding. Even if we just back up to 2014, when we had the 100-year flood here in Michigan, when a lot of homes in Berkeley and Royal Oak and Warren and all along that 696 corridor, east and west, flooded, basements flooded because, well, one could say the pumps failed, but let's be honest, there was a ton of water that came down. That was part of it. But if you're a home in that area, maybe it's worth it to think about carrying flood insurance. And it's certainly because it's not in the high risk area. I don't know that it would be cost prohibitive, but first you have to find out if your community is participating in FEMA program, right?
Right. Yeah. So that's exactly what FEMA does is, as many folks know, FEMA administers the flood insurance program. But the first thing that they ask is that a community become a participating community. And most of them are, but it's not a requirement. But if your community participates and the community is agreeing to certain standards about building codes and flood management, what have you, in exchange for that, FEMA says, okay, flood insurance is available to the homeowners here in this locale. And before the show, John, you were talking about, folks obtaining flood insurance where it's not required. And holy cow, what an important conversation to have with your insurance agent. Because I'd hasten to guess that area that you were talking about, I think the majority of those homes were not in a flood zone that required flood insurance, but they got hit. And, the nice thing is that if you're not in a zone that requires flood insurance, and you have that conversation with your agent, it's probably not all that expensive because you're not in the zone. And so it's a worthwhile conversation, I think, to have with an insurance agent.
Yeah, I agree. As our expert, insurance expert, Christine talked about, she talked about having that type of policy, even if you're not in a high risk area. And one of the things that I read that I thought was extremely interesting was that 20% of all flood insurance claims, that's 1 in 5, come from low to moderate flood areas.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Like I said, it's not what we expect when we have that picture of flood insurance in our mind and who it affects. I had a couple of interesting stats too. 90% of all the natural disasters in the United States involve some degree of flooding. And then conversely, there's only 12% of the homeowners nationwide that are carrying flood insurance right now. So, the statistics don't bear out, do the right people have the flood insurance? And the answer is probably not.
Yeah. One of the things that I think sometimes people count on is an area being declared a national disaster area, and then in comes the government aid. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. They just don't declare it a federal disaster area. And if your house flooded and is destroyed by that, and the government doesn't declare that, you're SOL.
You're out. Yeah.
You're out. Your total investment is gone.
Yeah. It's a problem, and it's a real gamble. And, and I think it's safe to say that for folks that received aid after their home was declared in the national disaster area, it's probably safe to say that there wasn't a declaration on a Monday and then the check started coming in on a Tuesday. It was probably a grueling, lengthy, painful wait with a lot of paperwork. Folks need to be considering flood insurance if they want to hedge themselves against this sort of thing.
Yeah, I had a client about a year ago who was buying a home that backs up to the Clinton River. Now, the property is, well, you did the loan. You did the loan for it. So the home sits probably 200 feet at least from it. And so an elevation survey was required just to find out, the whole topography of the land. And that was a $700 conversation. And I think that's one thing that I think most folks aren't aware of when they're buying a home that sits near or around a river, a creek. They don't think about that.
No. You're right. And, you think about a situation like that and, the two conclusions are sometimes drawn. Number one, I have this wonderful view of the river. It's right in my backyard, number one. And number two, I'm high up, so I don't have to worry about that river flooding and getting in my home. That's not the only dynamic at work. One of the things that the scientists will talk about is sheeting, or basically it's the water getting to that river that's down at the bottom of that hill. And if your home is in that path, like many of those are, that's why you're in the flood zone. It's not necessarily because of the river water rising, although that can be a risk. It's the other water that's on its way to the river, to where if there's enough of it, can inundate a home and knock it off its foundation and do a great deal of damage.
I was reading an article, and they were talking about a town in Nebraska. The name escapes me, but they described it as basically land that's as flat as a pancake, and the occurrence of rainwater before it can drain away, pooling and puddling, and basically rising to a point where it floods a home, and it's pretty common in those areas. And I immediately thought, oh my God, it sounds like Macomb County. And what does Macomb County have a lot of? Clay soil.
Sure. Oh, good point.
And clay soil takes a lot longer for water to eventually evaporate or move out.
Right.
So, I mean, when you think about the type of soil underneath the ground and the houses, all that kind of, you add that all together and you think, maybe it's not a bad idea to consider having that. Yeah.
It's so darn complicated. There's a lot of science at work, and I think the important takeaway for homeowners is it's not a yes and no black and white conversation of, hey, I have a home on the lake, therefore I need it, or I have a home that's sitting in a subdivision in Macomb County, so I don't need it. There's more to it than that by a long shot.
Yeah. One of the things that I found interesting, Tony, was, well, and NAR, National Association of Realtors, they're always in favor of disclosure, of sellers disclosing things to buyers instead of just buyer beware, buyer do your own research. And I think as a realtor too, you want as much information out there as possible for a buyer to make an informed decision. But what I found interesting was that there are almost 24 states out there that don't require disclosure of water penetration into a home.
Holy cow. I thought that was universal.
No.
You would have to disclose that.
I was absolutely surprised about that as well, that is not a requirement. Or if a home is located in a floodplain.
Wow. Yeah.
And it requires flood insurance. On our state disclosure in Michigan, that is a requirement. As a seller, you do have to indicate if the home has had any evidence of water and if you have flood insurance on the property.
Yeah.
Now, of course, how you get around that, if you're an all cash owner and you don't have a loan on it and therefore you're not required to have flood insurance, well, maybe you're not carrying it for that reason because it's less expensive for you.
Right.
So on that form, when you are asked that question, does your home require flood insurance? No. I don't know on the loan. only to a buyer who goes for a loan finds out, 2/3 of the way into the process, I got to have flood insurance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in defense of some sellers in that situation, if their home is free and clear and they're in a flood zone, they truly may not know. And so seller's disclosure is what? It's stuff to the best of the seller's knowledge. And if they don't know, it's not going to be out there. And then, hopefully, the next buyer is going to be obtaining a mortgage. And so that research is done. Because, you don't want the worst case scenario to happen, right? You didn't know you needed it, so you don't get it. Conversation doesn't come up. And then boom, 2014 again. And we have those big floods.
Yeah. These recent rainstorms that we've been having, I mean, the intensity of the rain that comes down in such a short amount of time is pretty frightening for how much water it dumps in such a short amount of time. Yeah. I've seen pooling of water in backyards. Almost things deep enough that you'd have ducks or Canadian geese floating in.
Yeah. I haven't washed my car in a month because the forecast keeps saying the next day there's going to be rain. And so I was like, well, what's the point? But, John, you bring up an interesting point as it relates to our topic today. One of the unique things about flood insurance is that there is a 30-day wait period. So
yeah, that's important to know. Yeah, glad you brought that up.
What a person can't do is listen to their weatherman and say, I've been kicking around flood insurance. This weekend looks like we're going to get a ton of rain. I'm going to go see my insurance guy. Won't work. You gotta.
Here comes this major storm system across the United States. Looks like Michigan's right in the center of it. I better call my insurance agent and get flood insurance.
Yeah. You can't get homeowners insurance when the house is on fire. It's after the fact. So same kind of idea. So yeah. And it does come up on the mortgage side, and that's usually where folks do find out, because as lenders we're required to obtain that certification to find out if the home is in a flood zone. Most building departments can and should be able to identify that as well if you reach out to them. Just as a matter of practice at Ross Mortgage, we're gonna pull that certification the same day the application goes live. So from a regulatory standpoint, lenders have to give folks notice at least 10 days prior to a closing, whether or not they're in a flood zone and therefore require flood insurance. Our folks that apply, they're going to know within a day or two after applying that they're in a flood zone or not.
So from a lender's perspective, do you think making more information available to the public, to a potential buyer, would be helpful? Or do you think that making that information available, especially now, let's just create an example. I'm a seller. I'm selling a home where I live. I was not required to have flood insurance, and I've lived there for 20 years, never had a problem. And a law gets passed that says, hey, by the way, now all FEMA's information based on flood history over the previous X number of years is now available for any buyer to go to this website and find it, or any lender to go to this website and find it based on address. Yeah. So seller's been living there for 20 years, no problems, and wasn't aware of any issues. And the clue reports that our expert, Christine, from the insurance company talked about only goes back 5 years. Right. Any claims beyond that, you're not going to know about. So this database is now available. They go back and find out this home was in repeated floods for a period of 5 years, 30 years ago, before this current owner has took possession. And now, I mean, if you're a buyer, do you roll the dice?
Right.
And so, I mean, there's the competing argument, right? I mean, seller's detriment to value, and buyers obviously right to know history of property. Yeah,
I'm torn, John, to be honest with you, both as a consumer and as a mortgage professional. On one hand, part of me says, hey, not only is this potentially relevant information, but this is information that is based on claims that have been paid out with taxpayer money, right? I mean, that's kind of what FEMA is all about. So there should be some degree of a right to know. On the other hand, isn't there always the challenge of context? what was all the circumstance that existed 25 years ago when that flood happened?
The levee broke, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And,
yeah. So, because, look what FEMA does. They update their maps periodically because things change. If you're not in a flood zone on a given day, and then a developer comes in and they put in a huge mall and they're making parking lots and exit ramps and things like that, and they're changing the topography of the land, and FEMA says, you know what, things have changed. You're kind of in the path of danger right now. You are now in a flood zone. FEMA does that for a reason. If you take the scenario that you're talking about, if a person looks back into history on old claims and said, I'm at risk because of this claim from 20 years ago, I would be fearful that they wouldn't have all the context, and might be making a decision for the wrong reason. I don't know if that's a good enough reason to suppress the information, but like anything, I think if the consumer can be properly educated to take it for what it's worth, I guess that's the thing. I'm really on the fence with that one.
Yeah. But I will tell you that that NAR is of the belief, and I think most of us as realtors are of the belief that the more information you can provide to a consumer to make an informed decision, the better.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, my goodness, it's a litigious society. It's been one for a long time. If there's a problem and somebody finds out that there was a relevant event from many, many years ago that wasn't disclosed, here come the attorneys, So, I guess my argument about contacts is just a proper education of the consumer and making sure that they're looking at facts in the right light to the extent that we could help make that happen.
Right. And so currently, what do buyers have at their fingertips to find out, or to, I guess, do as thorough an investigation as possible on a home to see if it is, in fact, in an area that frequently floods or is prone to flood due to certain circumstances? So, I mean, beyond looking at flood maps, beyond looking at property records, and a home inspection, that's kind of the extent you got currently to find out.
Right. John, go back to your example in 2014. People could have done all that research, purchased a home in Clawson,
and would have found nothing.
They would have found nothing,
right,
to not purchase that home, and then boom, they're floating.
Well, let's talk about an example that you and I were talking about in regards to areas that flood repeatedly, and the homeowners get reimbursed from FEMA, and they go in and they rebuild on the exact spot, build the same exact kind of house without any modifications or design changes in order to accommodate the fact that that area is prone to flood. Right. It amazes me that stuff like that isn't legislated and required in order to allow homes to be built again on that same spot. Yeah. You would think that stuff like that would change. Materials used, the height off the ground to accommodate waters coming in. And you and I were talking about Key West. I mean, Key West is an example of an area where if you've ever been to Key West, those homes are not ground level. Right. You've got to walk up 10 to 15 stairs to get to the house level. So they're all, well, I can't say all, but a lot of them are built to withstand the hurricane flooding that happens every year on Key West. Sure. And let's talk about your example in North Carolina.
Well, yeah. So you have situations on barrier islands where there's a great deal of erosion. There's heavy duty wave action, and in certain areas the coast is just lined with homes, very, very, very expensive homes to boot. And, the problem is that, a home is destroyed and it's rebuilt on the back of FEMA and taxpayer money. And then it happens again and again. And at some point in time, when does somebody say, all right, wait a minute here, this is a poor decision. Yeah. Now the property rights folks are going to say, hey, this is their parcel. They should be able to do what they want. And there's some truth to that. The problem is that the rebuild money isn't coming from that homeowner's pocket. It's coming from the subsidized insurance program. Something's going to have to change with what you're talking about, John, because FEMA is on a path to becoming insolvent with the way it's handled now.
And flood insurance will get so cost prohibitive that it may just disappear, and it's you buy a home in an area where it's prone to flooding, you're on your own.
Yeah, and John, boy, think about the impact of property value. One of the big things that supports value is the ability to buy it and sell it and finance it. Well, if suddenly it can't be financed anymore because that flood insurance is not available,
it can only be bought with cash.
Right.
Does that change the value?
Plummets.
Yeah.
Both for perception, unavailable financing, the whole 9 yards. So, it's really something that a consumer needs to do a deep dive on. Probably for any property, but certainly properties that are prone to any sort of inundation from water for sure. Yeah, I think we're looked at as the bad guys often as the lender because we're the ones that often require it. But it's a joint benefit. The insurance it protects the lender, but it certainly
you're taking a risk as a
too.
lender.
Sure.
So I mean, you've got to judge how much risk you're willing to handle and take on as a lender.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. If somebody owns a home and they do have a catastrophic flood and they don't have flood insurance, they don't have a whole lot of incentive to keep making those house payments. What they bought is now worthless in many cases, and so hence the insurance. There's got to be some sort of safety net in there.
Yeah. I guess I still come. I know you're on the fence on this, but I still come down on the more information for for a potential buyer, the better. Somebody made an analogy. It's not my own, but I think it's certainly appropriate. How the hell can you get flood insurance through Carfax to find out whether a car that you're going to purchase was in a flood in an area and is being resold, but you can't find out about a house?
Well, it's a fair point, isn't it?
I thought it was a very fair point.
Yeah, true.
One of the things that you and I were talking about earlier is that if a home is continually in a flood, that at some point you exhaust your eligibility for FEMA coverage.
Yeah. And that's appropriate, I think. I mean, it's just, there can only be so much, reaching into the government, war chest, to rebuild properties that are clearly in the path of danger. And, should there be such a program? Absolutely there should be, but it needs to be kind of coupled with some good comprehensive decision making about where to build, how to build, and, when to, let's face it, these kind of areas are dynamic. They don't stay the same. And so when you reach that point where the decision has to be made, we can't do this again. Can't build on this parcel.
Right.
Yeah.
I can't help but see the parallels between FEMA and earthquake insurance, flood insurance and earthquake insurance.
Yeah.
After the 94 Northridge earthquake, earthquake insurance was impossible to find. It was so cost prohibitive. So the government had to step in and offer it. Yeah. And of course, the cost was so high that most homeowners just said, can't afford it, not going to buy it. And so here we are 25 years later after the Northridge quake, and I'd say the percentage that have earthquake insurance is minimal.
Wow.
And there's going to be another earthquake. But what's interesting is that a lot of the building standards changed.
Okay.
Certain things had to change with regards to construction. Up until the 94 earthquake, did you know that most homes out in California particularly are built on slabs or on crawl?
Okay.
And so if they're sitting above the ground, it was not a requirement up until that point for a home to be bolted to the foundation. It just sat on it.
No way.
So when you had the earthquake happen, you had a lot of homes that fell off their foundation, fell off their supports because they weren't attached.
Wow.
Well, that changed, right? And so as people were buying those homes, they were requiring sellers to attach those to the foundation, secure those to the foundation. One of the other things that changed that I thought was interesting about earthquake insurance at that time was up until that point, when they constructed homes, they were only required to construct homes to support them shifting side to side or front to back. Okay. They weren't required to build homes to be able to withstand shifting, turning, almost like, turning sideways, turning back, turning sideways, turning back. Yeah. So what happened when a lot of these homes in the Northridge earthquake and apartment buildings too experienced that, they collapsed. So they changed the standards in buildings out there so that they could withstand turning side to side, front, back, sideways, sideways. And so they changed the building standards to withstand that. So it's interesting how some things change, but yet I don't know enough about what other states that are in flood zones are requiring of builders when they're constructing these homes. If they're requiring them sit above grade by a certain number of feet, if they're requiring the use of certain types of materials so that the home doesn't just get destroyed by the water. So interesting, just the comparison between the two, and how you're right. I mean, FEMA will become insolvent if they continue down this path. And so one of the things that somebody suggested, which I thought was interesting, is maybe FEMA should take a proactive approach to determining floodplains and incorporate the rise of sea levels, lake levels, river levels in determining the areas that are high risk, and low to moderate risk becomes a larger area. So I suppose that's one approach to perhaps saving it from insolvency.
Yeah. You know, and I think, like a lot of government agencies, you know, a big problem is staffing and budget, right? And real estate sprawl happens at a pace that is probably sometimes quicker than what FEMA can keep up with. And so you end up with outdated information or outdated standards and so on. And it wouldn't surprise me to find out that the standards that FEMA sets forth to a community say, hey, here's what you have to do to be a participating community, are not necessarily up to current engineering knowledge of how things should be done.
Right.
So it's it's a bit of a horse race where the ability of the insurance and the engineering behind it may not even be current with where we're at right now. So it's tough.
Yeah, just a couple things I found interesting. Some of the things that aren't covered in flood insurance. Swimming pools and landscaping, basement improvements. That was a shocker to me. Yeah. I didn't know that if you spend $70,000 in your basement making a man cave down there and having a wet bar and a wine cellar and all this other stuff, and a flood comes in and trashes it, you're SOL in FEMA's mind.
I don't think that's inappropriate, myself. I mean, that's basically FEMA saying, hey, we gave you a heads up. You're in a flood zone where there's risk, and you're going to do below grade improvements like that. Sorry, not on our dime. That's just my take on it.
Yeah. I found that interesting. Some of their some of the things that they don't cover. That was pretty interesting. I guess we got to go. We're right up against it, and I know there was more stuff that we wanted to cover, but oh well.
Yeah, we'll catch that on another episode.
We'll catch it on another episode.
Yeah. There's lots we can talk about as far as what's it mean when you get a flood cert and it's got certain indications on it, and what do you do to dispute it, etc. So we'll leave that as a teaser, and we'll catch it next time. So. Hey, thanks for listening to Avoiding Real Estate Turbulence. If you'd be so kind as to subscribe, review, rate, we would appreciate it. Please share with your friends, family, and coworkers that they too can find us on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify.